These are clearly extraordinary times. This is an extraordinary meeting for us, and we're really keen to hear from you. Let me just begin by saying a word or two about the community of practice. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we're now about 5,000 strong. We're folks from 70 countries. About 2/3 of you are from the global south, or whatever that means these days. We've got 10 working groups. We've been going for about 10 years. We started out, as many of you know, primarily as a peer learning group. I would say now our ambitions are, even before this crisis, have been somewhat raised to try to focus on moving the needle in terms of development practice and the way issues of scale are dealt with by not only funders, but implementers and by host country governments. Clearly, the current mess has added an important new dimension to that, and it's that mess and that dimension that we want to talk about today. We've got a very busy agenda for doing it. There are several of us with small talking parts in this, but the primary purpose is to listen to you and hopefully to get some guidance from you about how you think we can be most helpful. I'll say just a word about those of us who are going to be speaking, and then we'll jump right in. The first person after me is going to be Lon Mercado, who is the person that directs scaling efforts at CRS, but at least as importantly for this purpose, has a long history of working with operational and with advocacy NGOs in her native Philippines. We've asked her to both comment on the situation and then react later on in the session to some of the things that you all are going to say. The next person you'll hear from is Charlotte Coogan, who is the program manager for the community of practice, but also co-chairs our nutrition working group. Charlotte's going to try to take you through a series of questions we've prepared where your input would be helpful to us and help us in turn try to be useful to you. Then you'll be hearing from Simon Winter. Simon Winter is newly joining our core team, and particularly to help us advance a 5-year campaign that you'll be hearing more about to try to move development practice. We had that ambition even before the current crisis, but it clearly takes on a new dimension throughout all of this. You'll be hearing about that principally from my colleague in crime, Johannes Lin, who I've been leading this community of practice with for its 10 years. That's a lot of people, it sounds like, on our side, but I promise most of the time is given over to hearing from you. There's a chat box on this, and even though we're going to be using a Mentimeter, if any of you have things you want to say above and beyond that, we not only invite it, we encourage it. And at the end, we're going to again make an appeal for additional input from any of you who might be interested in doing exactly that. Please use it. This is not a briefing session by us to you. This is primarily an effort on our part to hear how we can be most useful to you and what it is that you're actually going through. So the more forthcoming you are, the better position we're in to both channel that energy and respond to it to the extent that we can. With that, let me hand off to Lon, and again, welcome you all to today's session.
Thank you to the scaling community of practice for this chance to join you at this town hall meeting. And I'd like to just greet everyone who have joined us today. As Larry said, this is mainly meant to be a listening session because although we know firsthand of the experience of many of our own individual organizations and our peer organizations, and we've read about what's been happening at the country level to not just international NGOs, but also national civil society actors and even governments. It's good to have this space to talk about how the crisis has affected us individually and collectively. Of course, this crisis has been characterized mainly as the result of the US's withdrawal of financial support for development, humanitarian, climate inclusion, and a host of other important areas of work. But while the US withdrawal of funds is the latest, although the largest and most dramatic in a trend that started last year, it is a trend that has begun much earlier, when donors like the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency closed out hundreds of NGO contracts, and the Dutch government announced reductions in development aid. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Dutch government announced another 70% of reduction in its development funding, and I think none going now to climate or advocacy. So although the most evident and painful impact of this trend is the financial crisis, to see the situation only from a financial point of view would miss the larger and perhaps more important picture, that this is a systemic shift in the power dynamic inherent in international development relationships. Institutional donor governments have been slashing and redirecting budgets to follow changes in their own foreign policy agenda and priorities. And alongside that, redefining who they want to support, who they want to fund and relate with as partners. The withdrawal of funding support and the larger issue of the systemic shift are existential threats to international NGOs, but even more so for national civil society actors that have been reliant on the role of INGOs as funding intermediaries. Of course, both international and local actors are now grappling with the loss of income, but I mean, let's face it, INGOs have reserves of varying amounts, while local civil society organizations have hardly any. In the Philippines, I have been participating and speaking in a number of forums on the impact of the funding crisis. And I don't know of any Philippine NGO that was largely dependent on US aid funding through intermediaries that have reserves that could allow them to last the review period, let alone the whole 9 months that this process is supposedly going to take. I've also read that the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, or ICVA, ran a survey between January and February 7, and that survey showed 67% of the 246 NGOs that responded to that survey suffered immediate program shutdowns, staff layoffs, and increased risks for already at-risk populations. Back then, they were guessing, and I am supposing that now that percentage has increased. I also know that INGOs, including my own, the Catholic Relief Services, are trying to protect partners through the use of reserves and, scrambling for additional funds, but are finding this extremely difficult. And like international NGOs, national NGOs are also trying to diversify funding, but find this extremely challenging because they have been locked into a system that had not allowed them to diversify before. In the Philippines, discussions have started on how private Philippine funders, corporate foundations, and other philanthropic groups can step up. But even if they did, this won't be able to fill even the gap left by unissued back payments. That's just how massive the financial gap is. But I also want to mention a bit of positive news. I am aware that an Asia Climate Philanthropy Advisory Council, the first of its kind in the Asia region, dedicated to gravitating ultra-high net worth Asian individuals towards climate, aiming to, and let me quote from their own announcement, they're aiming to raise significant amounts of funding in the next 5 years to catalyze Asia-led climate solutions at speed and at scale. End of quote. I just want to emphasize catalyze, speed, and scale. This is from the Advisory Council's announcement itself. I think this move by Asian philanthropists illustrates the obvious, that huge amounts of funding are gone. The climate crisis, along with development and humanitarian problems, all remain. And the vulnerabilities to poverty, inequality, conflict, climate-related disasters have been intensified by the massive reduction in financial resources. and hence, against that backdrop, the increased importance of catalyzing scale. This crisis, I think, has brought us to a crossroads, and we might want to take some time to consider how we could use this moment to drive transformation, to consider an alternative model for international aid that could rectify the flaws in the dominant relationship between funders, international actors, and local leaders. As it has been said, don't waste a good crisis. And I think while we have immediate and urgent problems before us, we can also take a step back to imagine what else we can do, not just to address what's in front of us, financial survival, but also to step up and take the challenge and use this opportunity as an inflection point, redirect this model that we have been used to. Of course, it's easier said than done, but we know and we have been through difficult projects, and I think one such is ahead of us. I'll stop there and let me hand back to Charlotte.
We're using Mentimeter today to try to do some interactive polls and hear from all of the folks on this call about how these recent events have affected you personally. But basically, the way that this is going to work today is I'm going to share some questions on the screen. I'll briefly describe the question as well as give guidance about how to respond to it. And I'll give you all a chance to actually put in your answers. I'll flash the answer up on the screen really quickly because everybody wants to know what other people say. And then we'll move on to the next question. So I think people are getting on fine. And I'm going to progress us to the next slide. So this one's just a warm-up for us. We want to know where people are calling in from. Cool, interesting. So a lot of folks from the US, I suppose that's because a lot of this is affecting US-based organizations, but Europe, some Latin America as well. Not too surprising that we don't have a ton of folks over in Asia given the time. And I'm moving us on to the next question. So this one is a bit trickier. This question is asking you how you personally have been affected by the recent changes in the funding landscape. And this is a 100 points question. So we have these different categories of how you might have been affected. And we're asking you to distribute these 100 points across the categories where you'll put more points into categories that sort of resonate more with you and fewer points into categories that don't resonate as much with you. So as an example here, if you lost contracts but are experiencing challenges with your remaining contracts because partner organizations were affected, you might put 60 points in the first category and 40 points in the second to try to show which of those is sort of the bigger effect on you. You have 100 points, you have to allocate all of them before you can submit. So go ahead and put in your responses. And I'm going to share, but you can still keep voting. Interesting. So what we're seeing is that most folks are saying that they were actually affected indirectly because their partners were being affected. But yeah, some people, are losing contracts or, being furloughed, and it's a pretty serious situation for a lot of us. And I know that it's been hard, even if it's just because your partners are affected. That can be deeply troubling to watch and try to support them as much as we can. So there's a saying, though, that in every challenge lies an opportunity, and it's healthy and productive for us to try to think through what those opportunities are here. At the scaling community, we thought about the 4 opportunities on this slide, and we kind of wanted to hear from you about which of these opportunities resonate the most with you. So this is another 100 points question, and we're asking you to allocate these points based on which you see as the most promising opportunity coming out of this work. So again, you sort of put the points based on the categories that you see as most promising, or few points if it's like a potential opportunity, but you don't necessarily think of it as important or as promising. Okay, and you can still vote while I'm sharing. Okay, so our most promising opportunity seems to be about focusing on localization and empowering local communities. I think this is related to what Lon said in her opening remarks about how those local CSOs are being really deeply affected, even if they weren't receiving direct funding from organizations like USAID. So thinking about how we can really work to empower them and insulate them from the future. I agree. I think it's an interesting opportunity and it's going to be important for us. So I have one last question on this section. Obviously, we're at a town hall for the scaling community of practice, but we really need to check in with ourselves and get your honest views about whether or not you think it's realistic to focus on scaling in response to the current crisis. So this is just a yes/no question. We're being a little bit direct here, but I think it's important for some self-reflection for us at this time. I'm going to share. You can still respond. It's a little bit of a relief to us to see that yes. Folks, do you think it's realistic to focus on scaling? Which is a good transition over to Johannes to tell us a little bit more about what the scaling community is actually doing now in response to current events.
Thank you, Charlotte, for making it possible for us to listen and to get this feedback from all the colleagues who joined today. By the way, many thanks for all of you to join us. I know for some of you it's maybe even late in the evening. Welcome anyway. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My name is Johannes Lin, and I am the co-chair with Larry Cooley of the Scaling Community Practice. And as we've learned from this brief feedback from you, but of course more generally around, I'm based in the Washington metropolitan area in the US, and here the chaos and the pain is palpable among the people that were directly affected in the administration. But of course, the pain is much, much bigger in many ways and much more severe out there where many of you are, namely, as we've heard from Lan, with many of the local organizations and the people who have in the past benefited and are now cut off from help. So your feedback that indicated that some of you have been severely affected directly, including laid off, but others also see the pain more generally in your partners and the people that you see affected is clearly there. And so, yes, we have to react as best we can collectively in addressing the pain, the immediate pain. And as we heard from Lan, some of this is being done, fortunately. And there is active consideration how programs that still are being funded can be redirected to fill the dramatic gaps in many cases. At the same time, as we've also heard from you, there are opportunities. Let me say, for those of you who feel, the few that felt there were no opportunities in this crisis for the longer term, as well as for you who thought that there's really no opportunity to think about scaling, we'd like to hear perhaps more from you, either in the chat now or if you'd like to send us messages, just to share with us why it is that you feel there are no opportunities, and also why you feel that a more systematic approach towards scaling, as Lan has already shared with us, is perhaps not the answer to the problem that you see. So please share, especially those of you who don't see the way forward, as we have begun to explain, and as I will say a few more words now to amplify on what we already shared with you in the newsletter that we circulated, and I assume you all saw. And indeed, I will repeat a few things we said there, because it does explain what we have in mind in trying to respond to this crisis, and yes, to what we think is potentially an opportunity to basically, as Lan said, catalyze what resources remain, what energy is in the system, and what ideas and creativity we know is there, and the willingness to form partnerships and the willingness to think long term and how we move forward, I think is catalyzing these resources that are still there is going to be the most important thing we can do. And what it means basically is that business as usual in the development and climate area is not really the answer to our problem today. Continuing with short-lived, standalone, unsustainable projects that have been too often supply-driven isn't the answer. We need to have solutions that are owned by countries and by communities. We need transformative scaling. We need long-term approaches and pathways that empower communities, and including, by the way, the private sector, yes, and also including the governments to take on the responsibility, ownership for sustained scaling over time. And your feedback on this score was very helpful because it confirmed very much our belief. So with this in mind and taking this as the starting point, we are planning on organizing a 5-year campaign 2026 to 2030, which is based in part on our already ongoing initiative on mainstreaming, scaling, and funder organizations that you're probably familiar with. And the idea of the campaign is now to actually carry the message beyond, the message of scaling and mainstreaming scaling beyond funders into the wider ecosystem of development and climate actors, which would include governments, yes, civil society organizations for sure, the private sector, yes, continuing to work with funders to the extent they're still in the picture, but also with intermediaries, with consulting companies, that advisory think tanks, academia, and so on, and also finally in the global standard setting fora. For example, Finance for Development conference is happening in Seville in June, and we hope to be able to promote the idea that we really need to change the development, if you wish, the development paradigm to focus much more systematically on locally led development, transformative development for impact at scale. So we put together a campaign team, Larry, Charlotte, Simon, whom we meet a little later, but also Richard Cole, who's our working group chair for the mainstreaming working group, and of course our executive committee. And by the way, Lan, whom you heard earlier, is very much an active part of our executive committee. And Lan, I thank you so much for being part of the committee, because we rely on the committee, our 30 plus members of the executive committee, to help us in getting this campaign organized. We've put together a strategic concept with a mission, organizationally and leadership, governance, and also the principal activities that we believe will help us implement the campaign. And ultimately, what we think is really necessary is to put what has been an informal organization of the scaling community practice on a more formal footing. And for that reason, that we have actually linked up with a partner organization, Dalberg Catalyst, a not-for-profit organization, where we expect that we will get Dalberg Catalyst to serve as a host, a formal host for us, then the scaling community practice as a more formally, legally existing part of an existing not-for-profit organization that is very much aligned with the overall direction of the mission and the objectives of the scaling community practice. We also, of course, have to reach out to funders to fund the campaign, because we expect to not only organize it as we've had much of the past in the community practice on a purely voluntary basis. For a campaign to succeed, we need to have some serious professional work carried out, leadership, and so we need some funding for that, which we hope to raise over the next few months, very much with Simon Winter's support, who we'll talk to you in a minute. We also are planning on public outreach. We've put together an op-ed that responds to the current crisis that we hope to publish maybe in the Financial Times. We submitted it, but we also are using social media very actively. Finally, let me just say your participation is going to be really critical, very important, and the rest of this conversation today actually is about your reaction to our campaign idea, the 5-year campaign, 2026 to 2030, and what you think you might be able and how you might be able to contribute. So with this, I think, Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's time to hand back over to you for another round of Mentimeter questions.
We are membership driven and we want to make sure that we are doing what makes sense to our members. So I have 3 questions just to gather some feedback on the campaign that Johannes mentioned. So this first question is about who should be the target audience of the campaign. So an target audience is really the people that we're trying to get to listen to our message promoting scaling. So these are mainly the people who we're trying to influence to adopt the scaling agenda. On the next slide, we're asking about who we can partner with to collaborate with us and join us in our messaging efforts. But for now, we're focusing on the audience. This is a 100 points question, so you can allocate your points across the different types of actors to tell us which you think should be the primary target audience and what other types of audiences are maybe less important but still relevant. So go ahead and allocate 100 points across these different potential audiences. And you should be able to still answer while I'm sharing. Interesting. So host country governments and foundations and philanthropies are the 2 targets. We've definitely been talking more about how to reach out to host country governments, as are doing some work now with foundations. So hopefully we're on track with that one. So going on to the next question, this one is about the types of partners that we should be seeking to join us in the effort. This is a word cloud, so it's a little bit different. So you'll be able to put in 3 responses for different types of partners. We're looking for both types of partners, categories like private foundations, as well as specific partners like the Gates Foundation. I'm going to share these answers as they are coming in, because we want you to adopt each other's wording if possible, if you agree with someone else. That way the word cloud will actually work. So if someone writes Gates and someone else writes BMGF, the word cloud isn't going to know that that's the same thing. So if you agree with someone else, use their wording. Go ahead and type in your answers now. There we go. I like this, people with money, yeah. Private sector seems to be the main one that's coming in a couple of times. Foundations also might be coming in a few times. Donors, interesting to have this idea of getting donors and foundations to work with us as partners in addition to as audiences. Government. A couple of specific groups. So I see co-impact there, definitely a good idea. Rockefeller, Bloomberg. Cool. So I have one more question on this set. What services should the campaign be trying to offer? This is a rank order question. So I think on your screen, there should be like a list on the bottom second panel, and then you're going to have to drag those up to the top panel, put them in order, and then submit. And you'll still be able, oh, there we go, 35. So the most voted was advocacy, working on global standards and norms. I think those are 2 things that have been on the list, but it's good to know that we're on the right track here as well. So thanks everyone for that feedback. I think it goes back to you, Lan, now to give us some reflections on the answers we've gotten today.
Thank you for giving me a chance to respond to the results of the Mentimeter. I could see there are very interesting responses, both to the earlier set of questions, but also to the mainstreaming campaign. And I just want to pick out also one comment in the chat from Russell, where he says that the problem with scaling lies in the fact that many people were excluded from the scaling programs of major funding organizations. which leads to a lack of trust in the charity communities. I 1000% agree. But I think there also lies the difference between what we know as scaling and what we're talking about in the scaling community of practice as transformational scaling, which isn't just about transforming the problem, the solutions to the problem and how we approach it, but it's also about transforming the relationships between the different actors who are collectively trying to address the problem. And transformational scaling recognizes and puts local ownership of the agenda and the solutions and approaches to the problem or the systemic change that we are hoping to achieve. And I am deliberately using the word ownership because I do want to emphasize that this is different from mere participation or inclusion in meetings or workshops or whatever else there might be. This is really about local leadership. It does not mean there is no role for INGOs or intermediaries. We just have to reimagine what other role we can play that continues to build mutual trust and accountability. But I also just want to perhaps add, maybe not just to the recent questions on the Mentimeter, but also what I said at the opening. There are probably three perspectives or approaches through which we can respond to the crisis and use this crisis as I've read in one article, use it as an inflection point. First, obviously, is management. Of course, this is focused on solutions to the immediate financial crisis individual organizations are facing. There's no getting away from that. But the second approach is probably where we can be deliberate and intentional about collaboration, especially with local actors, that goes beyond the confines of our own respective agendas, our own project partnerships, to one that carves out, holds, and facilitates spaces where we can have a conversation, understand the diversity of contexts, and find ways to work together to recover and secure a new funding system that could support global development efforts. And I do think that the mainstreaming campaign requires such a collaboration. Johannes emphasized this when he was sharing the background to the mainstreaming campaign. That collaboration really needs to begin with the community of practice and extend beyond us. And I think that's where the third approach lies. We need a visionary approach. And that means using this crisis to envision and build a new system, one where local leadership is at the heart and center of the agenda, the process, and the forms of a future model for international solidarity and cooperation. Over the years, of course, there have been progress on the localization process and the strengthening of local leadership. But to be honest and frank, this has been incremental. And perhaps this crisis gives us the opportunity to accelerate, which we can only do if we have the courage to break away from the old model. A dominant feature of that old model is the role of financial intermediary. That's the role that many INGOs have been doing. And of course, local NGOs would still welcome this role, especially as the barriers to direct access to funds remain. And there isn't enough financial management capacity yet among local actors, especially NGOs, to negotiate and manage large grants. But we do need to find ways to hasten and deepen the shift to a role that catalyzes sustainable and transformational scale. I'm glad to see that many still believe that scaling is realistic. And there are many paths to transformational scale, but the two that I'd like to highlight are systems change and I've been talking about local leadership. And a catalyst role for international actors means taking a step back and yielding to the leadership of local actors, whether that's government, the private sector, civil society, even regional bodies. It also means most likely that we need to be ready for messy processes processes that would not fit the log frame, or the new favorite, the theory of change. That break and the shift to a catalyst role in support of transformational scale will require many of us, many international NGOs, to act as facilitators, conveners, mediators, even connectors for knowledge sharing, and, as the mainstreaming campaign suggests, perhaps movement building. I think another aspect of a catalyst role is one that engages funders, this campaign precisely. Bearing in mind that one of the conditions of systems change is resource flows, the mainstreaming campaign that the scaling community wants to initiate has become even more pertinent and urgent in the face of the funding crisis. In fact, even before the crisis peaked with the US stop work orders, I now remember that the scaling community had already begun thinking of this mainstreaming campaign. And I do hope that we can move forward with fleshing out this plan, and with the participation and in collaboration with many of you, and also with other actors who may not be here today. So we'll come together again, I hope, as we take the next steps forward. Let me pass it back to, I don't know who I pass it to. Is it Simon at this time?
Yes, to Simon.
Great. Thank you. Greetings, everybody. So as Johannes mentioned, I'm Simon Winter. I'm the former executive director of Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture, now moving into a range of portfolio activities, not least of which is supporting the scaling community of practice and helping to lead the partnership development for the campaign. And your input on the previous questions has been incredibly helpful as we think about both how to position the campaign, but also who to position it to. We have a short list of foundations and funders, mostly private, some public, in view as potential financial contributors to and supporters of the campaign. But the campaign is not just about, money for advocacy. As I think we're hearing from all of you, the campaign is also about behavior change of funding organizations and implementing organizations and advocacy organizations and think tanks and research organizations within the international development sector. And my personal bias plan is very much in line with yours, that this country leadership, country ownership, and then rallying collective action by those who want to support that in whichever ways they want to, whether it's in particular sectors or it's in particular sub-national geographies or some combinations thereof and so on, has to be the way forward. That's how we're going to enable those interested organizations to do more impactful work with less resources of their own. And the role that public and public-private and public-private philanthropic partnerships can play in that is a particular hobby horse for me. So we have another set of questions for you, just 3 more. You'll be pleased to hear before we wrap up the survey. So the first question is a very direct one, which is, what about you getting involved with your organization? And again, this is one of those 100-point questions. So please allocate your 100 points. And then as we see that ticker building up, Charlotte, at the appropriate time, we'll start to reveal the results. And maybe just while you're pondering this, just to clarify, I think, a couple of points. I mean, when we talk about conducting advocacy on behalf of the campaign, that could be advocacy to any of those stakeholders that we were just talking about, whether they're funders who might want to implement scaling at an institutional mainstream level within their own organization, whether it's governments who may want to think differently and act differently about how they engage with cooperational partners on development agendas, whether it's think tanks who might want to do different kinds of research on behalf of the campaign. So it's really a very broad question, whereas supporting funder outreach, of course, is very specific. And for me personally, I'm very keen on that bottom one because that's what I've been tasked with. I see we're up to 19 responses so far. We have 58 people on the call, so keep those votes coming in. Once we get to 20, maybe, Charlotte, we can start to look at what the results are.
I'll go ahead and share.
We had 20.
There we go.
Finally got to 20. Okay, so not too many funders here, but we have one. So please follow up with Johannes or myself after the. I'll put my email in the chat as well. But please feel free to follow up if you do have either your own institutional funding or a direct line to support the funder outreach. So that would be great. And then obviously the other areas are all very important components of the campaign as well. So we welcome all types of contributions. Okay, so then this one we're not going to do a word cloud on, but if you're interested in volunteering in one of those or more of those bars we just looked at, please submit your name and your email in the tool now. And I'm going to put my email here in the chat. So if anybody wants to get more directly involved in supporting the campaign, you can also reach out to me as well. Okay, let's move to the final question, Charlotte, which is about the type of consultation. We've been having discussions in the core group about whether this is a helpful conversation or not. If it is, if you've shown up, I guess you think it's going to be helpful. So then the question is, how frequently would you like to have this type of consultation, particularly as we are mobilizing for this campaign over the coming few months and then looking to launch it by the end of the year. So you only have one response on this. You have to choose your preferred option about frequency of consultations. And bi-monthly is not every 2 weeks, it's every 2 months. At least that's how I read it.
Yes, that's so confusing, but yes.
That's always got me confused as well. And I guess as needed. Okay, wins. Right. Good. Okay. So that leaves it a little bit up to us or up to you to nominate and say that you would like to have a session. And if anybody is particularly keen on presenting in that session, that would be even better as well. So again, please get in touch around that. And with that, who am I handing back to close the?
Handing back to Larry.
Okay, Larry, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Lon. Thank you, Johannes. Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you most especially to all of you who stuck with us for this hour. This is not a, how would I say, it's not a performative art. This is a task that we're trying to do together. And most of us are volunteers on this, and we're doing it because we believe in what we're trying to do. The problem is it's really hard to know when we're doing it right and when we're doing it wrong, when we're helping and when we're not. So we really depend on you. In this case, we're not trying to solicit money, although we're happy for it, and we're going to have to do that. But we really are soliciting your active engagement. So if there's any way whatsoever you can think of involving yourself with what we're proposing, something we suggested or something we didn't on this, we really, really want that. This is not something I'm saying so we can tick a box and say we consulted. It's not that. We really feel like we're stronger together on this. And any of you who have time that you can contribute to this, who have thoughts you can contribute, please do. I'm going to flash up a slide that's got a way to reach us if you're able and willing to do that. You could either reach out directly through the community of practice. If by any chance you're not a member yet, there's no cost to being a member, please do that. It's the easiest way for us to keep you informed of what's going on. You can do that by just going to the website. Or you saw Charlotte and Simon's emails at various times during this presentation in the chat box. If it's trying to get involved in any way where Charlotte can facilitate, please reach directly to her. If it's particularly on the campaign or some of the actions we've been talking about on the campaign, it could be to any one of us, but I would suggest probably in the first instance to Simon on this. We're standing ready to do this. Some of us, Johannes and I, are in a sense in the post-retirement years on this, so we're not as affected directly as we know some of you are. But I want you to know our hearts are as much in this as they could possibly be. There's nothing you could ask us to do that we could do that we wouldn't try our best to do. So please reach out, but don't assume that there's somebody else there to do the work. This is really all of us together on this. And more than ever, I think we're a membership organization and only as strong as that membership. So please take the occasion to feel provoked to do something, whatever it is. It could be in concert with us or not. We don't care. But to do something to try to push this agenda ahead, because as Charlotte and others have said, I don't think it's Pollyannish to think this is an inflection point. One way or the other, it's an inflection point. Our intention is to try and flex it in a direction that will make the world a better place. So I want to thank you all for being a part of that before, today, and we hope into the future. I'll say thank you, and I'll hand it over to Johannes to say his own thank you.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to everybody who joined today. I also want to thank Gabi and her team at MSI for having us done a successful, at least in terms of technical work, successful webinar today. So thanks, Gabi and team. It's been great. My last thought really is that this is a scaling, if you wish, a scaling journey that we're on from the earliest years with the scaling community practice to now towards a greater impact, sustainable impact at scale, namely mainstreaming scaling throughout the ecosystem. And your help, it's only with your help, it's only with the kind of collaboration and the visionary approach that Lan stressed as key elements of any scaling and any effective development effort. So with your help, with your engagement, and we'll reach out to you again sooner rather than later, I think we can do it. And thank you so much for joining us today.